The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Brooke Sullivan pushed through the heavy glass doors of St. Michael's Hospital in Atlanta, the antiseptic smell hitting her before her scrubs even cleared the threshold. 0206 hours. Night shift. The same shift she'd worked for the last 7 years, the same corridors she'd walked 1,000 times, moving through the hospital like water finding its own level, present but unnoticed, competent but invisible. Her hand steadied the medication cart as she rolled it down the 4th-floor corridor, the wheels squeaking against the polished tile in a rhythm she'd memorized long ago. The fluorescent panels cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made skin look dead and made time feel unmoored from the outside world. She preferred it that way. Preferred the dark hours when the administrators stayed home and the doctors who knew her name were sleeping in their suburban houses, when the ward belonged to the nurses and the night itself. The tarnished military challenge coin sat heavy in her scrub pocket, pressed against her ribs where it had lived for 20 years. She never checked it. Never needed to. The weight was enough. It was the only proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had ever existed at all, the only physical evidence of a woman who'd spent 18 years in the mud and the blood and the broken bodies of a place called Helmand Province. The military had erased the rest, the files, the records, the photographs, the official acknowledgement. After the operation that officially never happened, they told her to disappear. So she had. Now she was just Brooke. Just a night shift nurse with steady hands and a habit of catching what other people missed. She moved through the break room at 0213 hours to grab coffee, the break room that smelled like stale coffee and the microwaved leftovers that lived permanently in the refrigerator. Her tray held an apple, a granola bar, and a cup of black coffee. Simple. Uncomplicated. The kind of meal a person could eat one-handed while charting with the other. That's when Dr. Caldwell walked in. She knew him by reputation long before she knew him by sight, the consultant who'd arrived 6 months ago, the one who took lunch meetings with pharmaceutical representatives and who wore watches that cost more than most nurses made in a month. He was the kind of doctor who talked over colleagues and talked down to nurses, the kind who smiled like he'd just thought of something cruel and was deciding whether to say it out loud. He smiled now. "Sullivan," he said, the way he said her name like it was a diagnosis he didn't like. He was tall, shoulders back, the kind of posture that came from always expecting people to move out of his way. He was right most of the time. People did move. She didn't look up from her coffee. "Dr. Caldwell. Heard you've been having some trouble with documentation lately," he said. His hand moved toward her tray with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Sloppy work for someone who's been here 7 years. She watched the tray in his grip. Her hand stayed steady on the edge of the counter. "Multiple medication discrepancies," he continued, his voice loud enough for the other 2 nurses at the table to hear clearly. Loud enough that his words filled the room like he was the only person who mattered. "Makes me wonder if night shift is really your calling, Sullivan. Makes me wonder if maybe administration should be looking at your record more closely." His fingers tightened on the tray. For one moment only, she thought about what her hands could do to his wrist, the 17 ways she could disarm him, the precise angle required for a strike that would leave him on the floor without leaving visible marks. Muscle memory was a living thing. It stayed in the body for 20 years. For 100 years. She felt it rise up in her shoulders like a tide. Then she breathed it back down. "I've reviewed the charts," she said quietly, her voice so measured it sounded mechanical. The discrepancies were transcription errors from day shift. All documented in the incident report. Caldwell's smile widened. He knocked the tray from her hands. The apple rolled across the tile floor in a slow, almost lazy arc. The coffee splashed, and the cup tumbled end over end before crashing against the baseboard with a sound like breaking glass. Granola scattered like shrapnel. The room went dead silent. The other 2 nurses, Morrison and Chen, sat frozen at the table, their forks suspended halfway to their mouths, their eyes wide with the particular shock of witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing but couldn't look away from. Caldwell's voice dropped into something almost conversational. "Pick that up, sweetheart." Brooke looked at the apple on the floor, the coffee spreading in a dark stain across the white tile, the granola crumbs scattered like evidence. She felt her jaw clench once. Just once. Then her face returned to its carefully neutral expression, as empty and blank as a surgical waiting room. She crouched without a word. The tile was cool against her palms as she gathered the pieces. Her hands didn't tremble. Her breathing didn't change. She collected the apple, the granola fragments, the broken cup, all the pieces of something that had been whole moments before, and deposited them in the trash with the same precision she would use to organize a surgical tray. When she stood, she was already moving toward the sink, already rinsing her hands, already erasing any sign that what had happened had affected her at all. Caldwell was already gone. She dried her hands on a paper towel and moved back into the corridor without looking at Morrison or Chen. She didn't need to see their faces to know they were staring. She could feel their eyes on her back like pressure against skin. By morning, the story would be told and retold, each version slightly different, but the essential fact would remain the same. Caldwell had humiliated the night nurse and she'd done nothing. She'd picked up her mess and walked away. He'd win the small victory he'd engineered, and by next week he'd win another one, and another one after that. He needed her gone. She understood that much. She didn't understand why yet, but she would. 20 years of training had taught her to observe, to note inconsistencies, to understand the patterns underneath the surface noise. She'd noticed the pharmaceutical rep who visited his office every Tuesday at 1,430 hours. She'd noticed the billing codes on the pediatric ward that didn't align with actual procedures performed. She'd noticed the way his eyes had gone careful and calculated when she'd caught him reviewing those same charts 3 weeks ago. But she said nothing. She documented nothing. She simply existed in her invisible way and waited for the pattern to reveal itself. At 02 for 7 hours, the elevator doors opened on the 4th floor and a man in Army Ranger dress uniform stepped out, his uniform so pressed it looked like it had been laminated, his bearing so rigid it seemed to require its own structural support. Captain James Reeves. His 7-year-old daughter was 2 steps behind him, small enough that he had to adjust his pace to keep from leaving her behind. Maya. Her name was on the chart that had been placed in Brooke's hand by the charge nurse with something that looked like apology in her expression. Pediatric ward consult, the charge nurse had said quietly, sliding the chart across the desk. Dr. Caldwell requested you specifically. Room 347. He said you were good with the difficult cases. Brooke hadn't responded. Difficult cases meant cases where the easy answers had already been tried and failed. Difficult cases meant doctors who'd run out of ideas and needed someone to catch what they'd missed. Difficult cases were the only cases she actually wanted. She was on her way to 347 now, the chart in her hands, her eyes moving across the documentation with the speed of someone who'd learned to absorb information the way other people absorbed sunlight. The child had been examined by 20 different doctors over the course of 4 days. Pediatrics, cardiology, pulmonology, infectious disease, neurology, rheumatology, genetic specialists from Emory, allergists, immunologists. Every test had come back inconclusive. Every imaging study was normal. Every laboratory panel was within normal limits. But the child was dying. Brooke could see it on the chart in the descending oxygen saturation numbers. 96%. 94%. 91%. 87%. 83%. Dropping lower with each notation, each entry marking another doctor's failed attempt to understand what was happening inside this small body. She pushed through the door to room 347 at 0251 hours. Maya was asleep in the hospital bed, but her sleep was the shallow, effortful sleep of someone whose body was working too hard to breathe. The oxygen mask covered most of her small face, the tubing secured with tape that seemed too aggressive for something so fragile. And her lips, Brooke's eyes locked onto them immediately and didn't look away, her lips were blue. Not faintly cyanotic. Not borderline. Blue like the ocean in deep water. Blue like someone wasn't getting enough oxygen no matter what the monitor said, no matter what the most recent blood gas claimed. Captain Reeves was asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted back against the wall, his uniform still perfect even in unconsciousness, his jaw clenched even as he slept. A man carrying the weight of a daughter he couldn't protect and a disease he couldn't fight and a military mind that understood strategy and tactics and failure in ways that translated directly to watching your child disappear in a hospital bed. Brooke pulled the chart closer and began to read. The chart scattered across the hallway tile like playing cards from a collapsed hand. Brooke didn't flinch as Dr. Caldwell dropped them at her feet, his Italian leather shoes planted inches from the scattered pages, the shadow of his body blocking the fluorescent light overhead. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the nurses circulating past the supply station to hear. His voice carried the weight of a command delivered to someone far beneath him. "Your documentation is abysmal. 7-year-old Reeves is still seizing and you're the reason we can't move forward." Brooke crouched without a word. Her hands gathered the pages with the same precision she once used to apply tourniquets in a sandstorm. Her jaw clenched, once, then released. She didn't look up. She didn't meet his eyes. She simply organized the charts in the order they'd been filed, stood, and held them against her chest. "I'll review the documentation," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Caldwell's smirk widened. He'd expected tears. He'd expected defensiveness. What he got instead was compliance that somehow felt like dismissal, and that absence of satisfaction gnawed at him. He needed her broken. He needed her to quit so cleanly that no one would ask questions about why she'd suddenly left, so cleanly that she'd never noticed the billing codes he'd been inflating on the pediatric ward, the $847,000 in phantom procedures that flowed straight to his consulting company, the pharmaceutical rep who'd just deposited another $12,000 into his offshore account for pushing their new anticonvulsant on every pediatric diagnosis regardless of actual medical need. He called her station 2 hours later. "My office. Now." The disciplinary file was already printed. 20 pages thick. Caldwell sat behind his desk with the papers fanned like an accusation, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany surface. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Atlanta skyline at 0137 hours, the city still glowing, indifferent to the destruction of one quiet night shift nurse. "Administration is concerned," he said, sliding the file across the desk. "Allegation, administered for medications without proper documentation. Allegation, failed to record vital signs on pediatric patient. Allegation, acting outside scope of practice." Brooke read the pages without moving them. Her eyes tracked the accusation, the carefully worded language, the signature line where she would be asked to acknowledge charges she had not committed. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them, that sound like insects trapped in plastic. "These are false," she said. "Are they?" Caldwell leaned back in his chair. "I have 3 nurses who will testify they saw you administer medications without recording them. I have charts that show medication times that don't match your documentation. I have a pattern." His voice dropped to something intimate and poisoned. "You're a good nurse, Brooke, but you're sloppy. And sloppy gets people killed. I'm putting you on administrative suspension pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your badge and your access codes effective immediately." She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement of the charges, not an admission, just a signature. Her handwriting was perfect. Controlled. Military in its precision. What Caldwell couldn't see, what no one at St. Michael's could see, was that Brooke Sullivan was only the identity she wore on a lanyard. The real woman, Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, had survived far worse than disciplinary files and false accusations. She'd survived Helm and Province. She'd survived the operation that officially never happened. She'd survived being erased. An administrative suspension was nothing compared to a mortar round at 200 meters. But Caldwell needed witnesses. He needed staff morale on his side. He needed the narrative to be bulletproof when the board reviewed the file. So at 0213 hours, he stood at the nurse's station with 6 staff members organizing medications, their tired faces illuminated by the glow of computer screens. The night shift was skeleton crew, 8 nurses for 300 patients, everyone stretched past breaking. "I'll make you all a wager," Caldwell said, his voice carrying that false joviality of men who'd never held real power but wielded institutional authority like a blade. $20 each. Sullivan quits within 1 week. I'd say Monday, but I'll be generous. Next Friday. She won't last. She's a good nurse, said Marcus, one of the senior RNs, his voice uncertain. She's incompetent, Caldwell said flatly. And too proud to stay where she's not wanted. $20 says she's gone by Friday. He smiled at Brooke as she emerged from room 342, her empty hands hanging at her sides, her eyes already moving toward the medication cart. Right, Brooke. You're not the type to stay somewhere you're not appreciated. The room went silent except for the ventilator hissing in a nearby room, the rhythmic beeping of a patient monitor, the tick-tick-tick of the wall clock moving into another minute of night shift that still had 6 hours to go. Brooke did not pause. She did not turn to face him. She selected 3 medication cards from the dispenser and moved toward the pediatric wing. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She moved like a woman who understood that survival required the absence of emotion, the presence of purpose. "I'll be here," she said, and those 4 words carried something in them, not defiance, but a clarity that made Caldwell's jaw tighten. He'd heard combat veterans speak with that same tone. That same absence of doubt. The room stayed quiet for 3 seconds after she passed. Then Marcus let out a low breath and pulled out his wallet. "I'm in." 3 others followed suit. Caldwell had won without ever raising his voice, without ever making a direct threat, and that was what made him dangerous. He understood institutional power. He understood that in a hospital, the doctors held the narrative, and the narrative was everything. Brooke returned to room 347 where Maya's respirations were shallow, her oxygen sat still hovering around 88% despite the supplemental oxygen, her tiny chest rising and falling like the breath of something already fading. Captain Reeves had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, his uniform jacket still buttoned despite the heat of the room, his military bearing preserved even in exhaustion. Brooke didn't enter. She stood at the threshold, reading the monitors, analyzing the data, running through the differential diagnosis for the 23rd time in her mind. The child's lips were still blue. The oxygen was still wrong. Something was catastrophically wrong with the medical approach that every doctor, 20 doctors, had endorsed. She returned to the locker room on the ground floor during her scheduled break. 12 minutes of paid time that she'd spend alone. The lockers lined the wall like rectangular coffins. Her assigned unit was number 47. She turned the combination lock, 15, 32, 08, same numbers for 6 months, and opened the door. The challenge coin sat on the top shelf, behind her extra scrubs, exactly where she'd placed it when she started at St. Michael's 3 months ago. Tarnished silver. The weight of it was maybe 2 ounces, but it felt like ballast, like anchor, like the physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had existed. She picked it up. Held it in her palm. The obverse showed an American flag. The reverse bore a single word, Artemis. The code name. The only name that mattered. The name she'd been ordered to forget, the rank she was forbidden to claim, the service record that had been officially expunged from every database the moment she disappeared into this Atlanta hospital as just another night shift nurse in tired scrubs and a blank expression. She turned it over in her hand. Once. Twice. The fluorescent light caught the tarnish, threw it back in fractured patterns. Brooke Sullivan pressed the coin into her pocket, right against her thigh where the metal cooled against her skin, and returned to the pediatric ward just as the first alert came through on the overhead intercom. Code Blue, Pediatric Intensive Care. Code Blue, Pediatric Intensive Care. Room 347. Her feet were moving before her mind caught up. The hallway stretched and compressed. The emergency light seemed to strobe in slow motion. She could hear the attending physician shouting orders, could hear the crash cart approaching with its wheels stuttering against the tile, could hear the steady monotone of the heart monitor flatline cutting through the noise like a sword through silk. Maya Reeves was seizing. Captain Reeves was on his feet, his hands reaching for his daughter, his voice becoming something raw and broken. 2 nurses were holding him back. Dr. Caldwell was already in the room, his hands moving through the motions with the competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in controlled settings, never in actual crisis. But Brooke saw what he did not see. She saw the child's chest, the way it wasn't rising symmetrically. She saw the tension in the left side of the rib cage, the subtle collapse of the lung fields, the absence of breath sounds that no stethoscope had caught because no one had been listening for it, or rather, they'd all been listening for the seizure, for the obvious crisis, and missed the silent one developing underneath. Tension pneumothorax. A hole in the lung. Air in the chest cavity. Pressure building. The child's heart struggling to beat inside a cage that was slowly crushing it. She didn't think. Muscle memory took over. 20 years of training. 3 tours in Helmand Province. 18 hours in a field hospital outside Sanjan Valley with mortar rounds falling close enough that she could hear the shrapnel singing through the air. Brooke reached for the emergency supplies. Found the 14-gauge needle. Antiseptic wipe across the skin. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where it belonged. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. The sound like a tire deflating, like a held breath finally exhaling. The monitor changed. The chaotic rhythm organized itself. O2 sat climbed. 78, 84. 91, the child's color returned from that terrible blue to something approaching human. The room went silent except for the monitor's steady beep. 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 And then Dr. Caldwell's face went pale because he understood, in that moment, that he had no authority over whatever this woman had just done, that the needle decompression was not a nurse skill, that the precision and timing and pure instinct that had just saved that child's life came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere he could not touch and could not control. He did not ask her how she'd known. He did not thank her. He simply left the room and made the first call on his list of predetermined allies, the board member who golfed with him every Thursday, the one who owed him a favor from the malpractice case 3 years ago that had been quietly settled. By morning, the paperwork would be filed. By morning, Brooke Sullivan would be escorted from the building before the shift change, before anyone could ask too many questions, before the implications of what she'd done could spread through the hospital like a virus. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm at 0200 hours when Brooke Sullivan pushed through Maya Reeves's door. The child lay rigid against the mattress, her small body convulsing in a seizure that no anticonvulsant had stopped. Her lips were the color of slate. Her chest barely moved beneath the oxygen mask despite the 15 liters flowing through the tubing, despite everything the previous 20 physicians had ordered, despite 3 days of prayers whispered by a father who'd survived ambushes in the Hindu Kush but couldn't protect his daughter from whatever was killing her now. Brooke's footsteps made no sound on the tile. She'd learned to move like that in 2003, when footsteps meant the difference between staying alive and bleeding out in a supply depot near Lashkar Gah. She approached the bedside and her eyes moved across Maya's body with the precision of someone who'd assessed casualties under fire. The seizure wasn't the problem. The seizure was a symptom. The real problem was written in Maya's color, in the way her chest barely rose, in the pink frothy sputum at the corner of her mouth, in the way the right side of her chest looked subtly fuller than the left. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung weir had leaked into the pleural space and now compressed the heart and lungs with every breath. Not life-threatening in an hour. Deadly in minutes. Deadly in the next 5 minutes if no one decompressed the pressure that was crushing the child's organs. 20 doctors had missed it. Brooke had seen it in half a second. She moved to the supply cart and her hand was already reaching before her brain finished the thought. The 14-gauge needle sat in its sterile packaging, and she ripped it open with a motion that was half nurse, half something else entirely. Her breathing stayed level. Her hand stayed steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation, no moment of doubt that slowed her down. Pain was information. Pain was data. And Maya Reeves was in catastrophic pain she couldn't even voice. "I need you to stay calm," Brooke said to the sleeping father in the corner chair. Captain James Reeves didn't stir. She didn't repeat herself. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Textbook anatomy. She'd done this procedure on soldiers in Helmand Province who had hours left if nothing changed, minutes if the pneumothorax was severe. The needle slid through the skin and into the pleural space with the specific resistance she remembered, and then the hiss. The release of air pressure that had been slowly suffocating a child. O2 saturation on the monitor read 68. Dropping. It would climb now. It always climbed once the pressure released. 72. The seizure stopped. Maya's body went limp against the mattress as the air pressure eased and oxygenated blood finally reached her brain again. 79. Brooke's jaw was clenched so tight it felt like bone. Her left hand was steady on the needle. Her right hand was already moving to secure it with tape, to stabilize the decompression, to do everything by protocol, while every part of her that was Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, every part that had held a young private named James Reeves together while an IED explosion tore through a supply depot in 2004, stayed completely buried. 85. The monitor's beeping changed its rhythm. Not panic now. Not the frantic screaming of an oxygen-starved child. Normal. Almost peaceful. 88. Captain Reeves woke at the change in sound. His eyes snapped open and his hand came off the armrest, and for a moment he looked ready to stand, ready to fight, ready for whatever came next. But he saw Brooke's face and he saw the needle and he saw his daughter's color returning from slate to something almost pink again, and his body went slack with something that might have been relief or might have been something deeper than that. 92. Stable. "She's going to be all right," Brooke said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact delivered by someone who had spent 20 years making sure people didn't die on her watch. She picked up the phone to call the attending physician. Her hands were steady as she dialed. Her voice was steady as she reported the procedure: needle decompression, second intercostal space, pneumothorax resolved, vital signs stable. Each word was precise and clinical and gave away nothing about the fact that she'd just performed an emergency procedure that none of the hospital's staff had recognized as necessary. None of them. 20 physicians. Multiple specialists. Pediatricians. Pulmonologists. Cardiologists. All of them had stood in this room and looked at a dying child and missed the one thing that would save her life. Brooke had seen it in 30 seconds. Dr. Caldwell arrived 7 minutes later, his face still creased with sleep, his white coat not yet fully buttoned. He took one look at the decompression needle and his eyes went flat. He looked at Maya's vitals. He looked at Brooke. He looked at Captain Reeves, who was holding his daughter's hand and crying silently, the kind of crying that soldiers did, completely silent, just the shoulders shaking and the tears falling without a single sound. "Who authorized this procedure?" Caldwell's voice was very quiet. The patient was crashing. Brooke was already documenting the time. 0206 hours. Decompression complete. Vitals stabilized. She did not look up from the chart. "This is a pediatric patient. You don't have the credentials to." The patient was dying, Dr. Caldwell. She still didn't look at him. She filled in the vital sign trend line. O2 sat dropping from 68 to 92. Heart rate dropping from 164 to 88. Everything that showed a child returning to the land of the living. "You've exceeded your scope of practice. I'm documenting this." He pulled out his phone. His fingers moved fast across the screen. Typing. Texting. Calling in favors. "Get out of this room. Now." Brooke closed the chart. She looked at Captain Reeves for exactly 1 second. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the door, her movements the same fluid precision she'd used to move through a field hospital in Helmand Province while mortars landed close enough that she could taste the dust. What happened next ended careers. That's what the security footage would show later. That's what the hospital board would see when they reviewed the recording from the hallway camera. That's what would matter when everything fell apart. But in that moment, in the corridor outside room 347, there was only Brooke Sullivan and the knowledge that she'd just saved a child's life using skills that officially didn't exist. Skills from a woman who the military had ordered to disappear. Skills from someone whose name had been erased from every official record the day she'd been pulled out of Afghanistan in 2004 and told to become someone new. Dr. Caldwell was already making his third phone call by the time she reached the nursing station. Dr. Caldwell's footsteps hit the tile at 0213 hours like a metronome counting down to something final. He didn't knock. The door swung open hard enough that Maya flinched, her small body rigid under the warming blanket, oxygen mask still secured, her vitals climbing steadily on the monitor behind her. Sinus rhythm. 64 beats per minute. O2 saturation holding at 94%. Everything that should have been impossible 10 minutes ago was now textbook stable. Brooke stood at the window, studying the city lights of Atlanta spreading across the darkness below. She didn't turn. She'd been expecting this since the moment the needle had slid between Maya's ribs. "What exactly do you think you just did?" Caldwell's voice carried the particular edge of a man whose world had tilted sideways. His hands gripped the door frame. "That procedure requires attending physician authorization. Level 1 credentialing. You don't have either." Brooke's reflection in the glass remained still. The child had no pulse. No breath sounds. Cyanotic lips. 2 minutes from cardiac arrest. "That is not your decision to make." He stepped closer, his tone designed to wound. "You're a night shift floor nurse. You change for bags and document vitals. You do not perform emergency decompression on pediatric patients without supervision." Captain Reeves watched from the doorway where he'd positioned himself after Brooke's hands had brought his daughter back. His jaw worked. He understood what he was seeing of a woman who moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Someone who'd done it in places where there was no attending physician. Where there was only blood and sand and the choice between one action or no action at all. Brooke's hands folded once, a small movement. Her voice stayed level. "The patient is stable now. Because of luck. Because of recklessness." Caldwell pulled his phone from his pocket. "You've just violated Protocol Number 7, Subsection 3 of our credentialing bylaws. This is documented. Witnessed. And I'm calling the board." He made the first call while standing in Maya's doorway. Brooke could hear fragments. "Yes, right now, emergency credentials review, performed an unauthorized procedure on a pediatric case." By the time he finished that conversation, he'd already begun the second. The nursing registry director. Questions about her background. Requests for copies of her certifications. Mentions of discrepancies and scope violations. His voice dropped into a confessional tone, the wounded physician seeking clarity about a subordinate who'd gone rogue. The third call brought an HR investigator to St. Michael's by 0247 hours. A woman named Victoria Chen with a clipboard and a practiced expression of professional neutrality. She asked Brooke to step into the administrative office down the hall. Not a request. A command wrapped in bureaucratic language. The office was cold. Fluorescent lights hummed in the panels above. Victoria sat across from her with a pen poised over a form that already had checkboxes marked. "We're conducting an emergency credentialing review based on a report filed by Dr. Caldwell regarding an unauthorized medical intervention at 0202 hours this morning," Victoria began, reading from the paper in front of her. "Can you walk me through your thought process when you decided to perform a needle decompression on a 7-year-old patient?" Brooke's hands rested on the table, steady. Not folded. Not trembling. Just present. The patient had no pulse. No breath sounds. Cyanotic presentation. A 14-gauge needle inserted at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, would be indicated in any emergency medicine protocol. You're a nurse. Not a physician. Not an emergency medicine specialist. Victoria didn't look up from her form. You don't have the authority to make that call. The child would have died. That's not the legal standard here. The legal standard is credentialing and scope of practice. Victoria made a note. Another checkbox marked. I'm going to need copies of all your certifications, your training documentation, your entire employment history with any facility where you provided direct patient care. And I'm recommending immediate suspension pending a full review. By 03:15 hours, Brooke was walking out of St. Michael's with a cardboard box containing the contents of her locker. Her badge had been collected at security. Captain Reeves stood in the hallway watching her leave, his daughter sedated and stable behind him, his hand frozen at his side. He'd tried to say something as she passed, but Brooke had kept moving. There was nothing to say. She'd violated protocol. She'd exposed herself. She'd saved his daughter and guaranteed her own erasure in the same motion. The rain started as she reached her car, not a gentle rain, but sheets of water hammering the parking garage like something alive and furious. She sat in the driver's seat for 40 minutes without turning on the ignition, the cardboard box on the passenger seat containing 2 pairs of compression socks, a photograph of a beach she'd visited once in 2003, and a stethoscope she'd bought in 2009. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in East Atlanta that asked no questions and kept no records. She'd rented it under a name that wasn't quite a lie and wasn't quite the truth. Everything about her life existed in the margins where official records didn't quite reach. She laid the scrubs out on her kitchen table under bare bulbs. 3 sets. Navy blue with faded logos. One had a small bloodstain on the left cuff from a patient in March. She'd tried to get it out but the stain had set. A memory made physical. Brooke began folding them with the same precision she'd once used to fold flags at military ceremonies. Crease 1. Fold. Crease 2. Fold. The motions were automatic, her hands moving through muscle memory while her mind stayed somewhere else. Somewhere in Helmand Province where she'd taught a 19-year-old private named James Reeves how to apply a tourniquet when both his hands were shaking. He'd bled out anyway. She'd opened his chest on a cot made of canvas and metal, her hand steady while everything around them exploded into chaos, and she'd massaged his heart directly, direct cardiac massage, the textbooks called it, while rounds came through the walls and the electricity of adrenaline made everything move in slow motion. He'd lived. That private had lived because Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had known exactly what to do in a moment when no one else did. The tarnished challenge coin sat on her kitchen counter where she'd left it the night before. Military-grade metal, issued to her unit in 2004, the eagle and anchor worn smooth by 20 years of fingers finding it in darkness. It was the only proof she'd ever existed. The only documentation that couldn't be erased because it existed outside the system. No serial number. No registry. Just a coin and the memory of a man who'd been given a matching one and told never to speak of the woman who'd saved his life. She picked up the challenge coin. It was warm from sitting under the apartment's ambient heat. Heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight. The rain was still falling outside. She could hear it against the window, a percussion that matched her heartbeat. She thought about throwing the coin away. Letting the last 20 years dissolve into the Atlanta storm system. Becoming someone new. Becoming no one. She held the coin over the trash can for 8 seconds. Then she put it in her pocket instead. That's when she heard it, a sound cutting through the rain, distinct and impossible in her apartment at 0351 hours in the morning. Rotor blades. Helicopter rotors, the distinctive chop-chop-chop of a military aircraft moving through controlled airspace it had no business being in over residential Atlanta. Brooke moved to the window. The rain obscured the sky, but the sound was unmistakable. 2 aircraft. Maybe 3. Coming closer. She didn't know what was about to happen next. 3 days later, the intercom crackled. Code blue. Trauma Bay 3. Cardiac arrest. Incoming. Brooke was sitting in the conference room on the 4th floor when the alert echoed through the walls, that mechanical voice that still made her spine straighten even though she wasn't supposed to be here anymore. The hospital board had arranged the hearing for 2 p.m. Administrative suspension pending review. A stack of fabricated documentation in front of her, medication logs she'd never falsified, protocols she'd never violated, all stamped with Dr. Caldwell's signature like a confession he didn't know he was signing. The board members shifted in their chairs, reading from scripts prepared by the hospital's legal team. Brooke sat motionless, hands folded. Waiting. Then the commotion downstairs. Boots. Radio traffic. The particular urgency that meant a patient was coming through the ambulance bay with minutes left on the clock. One of the board members excused himself. Then another. Within 90 seconds, 3 of the 5 were gone, walking toward the emergency stairwell like the hearing no longer mattered. The remaining administrator glanced at Brooke. "We should recess." She nodded and stood, walking toward the hallway even though she had no authority to do anything but observe from behind glass. The ambulance door swung open on the 3rd floor. The patient was Afghan, dark hair, early 50s, clutching his chest, skin the color of old concrete. The paramedics were already calling vitals, possible STEMI, troponin elevated, BP 94/62, O2 sat 88%, patient reports crushing substernal chest pain for the past hour. The gurney rolled past the administrative hearing room, 40 feet from where Brooke stood in the doorway, and the Afghan man's eyes swept across the assembled faces. His pupils dilated. His head turned deliberately. His lips moved around a single word, barely audible over the chaos, Artemis. The code team froze. Not all of them. But a few. The older ones. The ones old enough to have heard that name whispered in barracks, in unit histories, in stories told by soldiers who'd been there. The retired Army Ranger working hospital security, Sergeant Clayton Mitchell, 19 years in the 75th, 3 tours himself, was stationed near the elevators. He heard it. His face went absolutely still. Then he took one step toward the stretcher, and his voice came out like a hammer strike, "That is Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan. She held a forward operating base for 18 hours under siege. She does not answer to this hospital. She answers to command." The word stopped the board members cold. The paramedic slowed. The patient kept his eyes locked on Brooke for one more second, and she saw recognition there, not just recognition. Gratitude. The kind that survives 20 years and 3 continents and new identities and new lives built on the rubble of old ones. The trauma team swept the Afghan man into Trauma Bay 3. Dr. Caldwell appeared 30 seconds later, already barking orders, his voice that particular pitch of authority that expected compliance. He didn't even glance at Brooke standing at the window, watching the monitors, seeing the cardiac tracing climb and fall like a dying bird. 2 minutes later, the phone rang. In the hallway. Directly to St. Michael's administration. A 2-star general was on the line. The board members emerged from their office 15 minutes after that, their expressions the color of ash. They'd received a call from United States Army Central Command. A visitor was en route. Not a request. A notification. Caldwell was still in Trauma Bay 3, still trying to stabilize the Afghan man's coronary occlusion, still completely unaware that the walls around him had started to collapse. General Marcus Holbrook arrived in uniform. Not pressed for a visit. Worn for work. His boots crossed the threshold at 2:51 p.m., and behind him were 2 Army CID investigators, Criminal Investigation Division, their badges clipped to their chests like pronouncements of reckoning. The general walked directly into the conference room where the board had reconvened, and he sat down with a classified folder thick enough to contain someone's entire life. "I'm going to read you 4 pages, he said. "Then we're going to discuss Dr. Caldwell's role in the attempted suppression of a decorated service member." The words came out measured and precise, Bronze Star. The board members shifted. Silver Star. Caldwell had finished his procedures upstairs and was walking toward the cafeteria, completely oblivious. 2 purple hearts. The general's voice carried no inflection, just fact after fact, layer after layer. Commander of Forward Operating Base Helmand 23. Medic to 4,847 deployed soldiers. Classified operation. Officially never happened. Record sealed. Identity buried. I knew, he pointed at Caldwell as the doctor walked past the conference room door, you attempted to remove her. The room stayed silent for 10 full seconds. That was when Captain James Reeves walked in carrying his daughter. Maya. 7 years old. Healthy now. Her color normal. Her breathing unobstructed. Her small hand holding her father's with absolute trust. Reeves was in uniform, army dress blues, and he stood at the end of the conference table with the bearing of a man who'd been standing beside this woman for 22 years, whether or not he'd known her face. "This is the medic who saved my life," he said. His voice was steady, but it had seams in it, places where emotion had worn through. "I was a private. 19 years old. Shot 3 times in the abdomen in a supply depot outside Sanjin. I was bleeding out. My sergeant was already dead. My squad leader was pinned. And she came in with morphine and gauze and hands that moved like they were part of something bigger than panic. She held pressure on my wounds for 43 minutes until the helicopter could land. 43 minutes. She didn't talk. She didn't cry. She just held me together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tarnished challenge coin. Army 75th Ranger Regiment. 2003, a tiny ding in the edge where shrapnel had caught it instead of catching him. He set it on the table in front of the board. "I carried this for 22 years. I never knew her name. I only knew that voice. That precision. That absolute refusal to let me die." Reeves looked directly at Brooke. "I know her name now." Dr. Caldwell's face drained like someone had pulled a stopper in his chest. His mouth opened. Closed. The general stood up, and when he did, every CID agent in the building seemed to materialize at the doorway simultaneously. The general's voice came out like a verdict. "Dr. Caldwell, your consulting privileges at St. Michael's are revoked effective immediately. You are being referred to the FBI Medical Fraud Task Force for investigation into billing code manipulation, pharmaceutical kickback schemes, and insurance fraud totaling approximately $847,000 over the past 3 years." The CNN cameras were already waiting outside. Someone had called the news, someone always does, and the general walked Caldwell past them with one hand on his elbow like an escort to a funeral. Caldwell's mouth kept moving, but no words were coming out anymore. His entire institutional architecture had evaporated in the space of 90 minutes. By month's end, Dr. Caldwell was teaching CPR at a strip mall community college in a different state, wearing a name tag that read Steve in faded blue letters. His hand shook when he held the training dummy's chest. His voice came out thin when he explained compressions. The nursing students could smell the shame on him the way you can smell rain before it arrives. But Brooke was standing in room 347. She wore her scrubs again. The one she'd folded so carefully 3 days before. They hung on her the same way, immaculate, pressed, ready. The challenge coin hung openly around her neck, visible under her collar, a small weight against her sternum that felt like finally exhaling. Captain Reeves stood at the window with Maya on his shoulders, teaching her to salute the way his father had taught him, the way soldiers teach soldiers. The morning sun caught the coin and threw light across the hospital floor in fractal patterns. Brooke checked Maya's vitals, oxygen saturation 98%, heart rate 88, blood pressure normal for a child her age. The tension was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was what always remains after rescue, the ordinary miracle of breathing and heartbeat and the privilege of watching someone come back to themselves. "Will you stay?" Maya asked. Brooke looked at the child's face, the color returning to her cheeks, the brightness returning to her eyes. She looked at Captain Reeves. She looked at the challenge coin in the window light. Yeah, she said quietly. I'm staying. The phone calls came all day after that. News stations. Major networks. A book publisher. The Pentagon itself, asking if she'd consider teaching at the Joint Special Operations Medical course. Offers to leave nursing, to go back into something that resembled her former life. Each one she declined with the same 3 words, "My fight is here now." Her hands moved from patient to patient through the rest of her shift, checking lines, adjusting medications, listening to the stories that broken bodies tell when they're finally safe enough to speak. A 72-year-old man recovering from bypass surgery. A teenager being treated for pneumonia. A woman coming through from a car accident, stabilizing, learning to breathe again in a world that hadn't killed her after all. By midnight she was alone in the medication room, and that was when she felt it, the trembling in her shoulders, the pressure behind her sternum, the particular shaking that comes not from fear but from holding everything together for so long that finally being allowed to let it out becomes its own kind of emergency. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the supply cabinet and let her body remember what it was like to survive. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint finally meeting release. It was 22 years of carrying someone else's story finally meeting the light. Scars tell stories. Some of them are visible. Some live under the skin where no one sees them, where they reshape you in ways that make you stronger and quieter and more precisely yourself. Brooke Sullivan had spent her entire life becoming someone who could save others. The last 3 days had finally made her someone who could save herself. When the shift ended at 6 a.m., she walked out into the Atlanta dawn and found Captain Reeves waiting on the hospital steps with 2 cups of coffee. Neither of them spoke. He handed her a cup. She sat down beside him. The morning air was cool against her face, and somewhere in the distance, a helicopter moved across the sky toward something that needed saving. She wondered if she'd ever go back. She knew the answer before she asked herself the question. Some soldiers go back to war. Some soldiers go back to the people who need them most. Some soldiers understand that the battlefield doesn't end, it just changes form. That saving a life in a surgical bay is the same principle as saving a life in a supply depot. That the uniform doesn't matter. That the job is the only thing that ever did. True class is what you do when the lights go out. This story spread. Her story. Not classified anymore. Not buried. Not erased. Within a month, 17 other veterans came forward at St. Michael's, people who'd been hiding their backgrounds the way Brooke had, who'd been waiting for someone to make it safe to be fully seen. The hospital established a veteran support program. They opened a VA wing. They started training trauma teams in the skills that battlefield medics use, because it turned out that peacetime medicine and combat medicine both speak the same language when the stakes are high enough. And if you're watching this, if you're someone who's ever hidden part of yourself because it felt safer, or because you believed that what you'd survived might make you a liability instead of an asset, consider this: the people who make the most difference are almost always the ones the world almost broke. The question isn't whether you should tell your story. The question is what happens to the world if you don't. Subscribe. Like. Comment. And if you know someone who's been hiding who they really are, share this with them. Sometimes all someone needs is permission to come home.